Talia Brooks is the sharp-witted engine behind a boutique urban development firm, but she is currently being squeezed between a career-ending contract and corporate sharks who view her as easy prey. While she prides herself on her street-smart ability to read any room, she realizes her polished leather jacket and curated smiles aren't enough to fend off the vultures. She needs a physical deterrent that commands unearned respect. She finds it in Han Seung-Kyu, a man seated on the rain-slicked pavement outside a glass high-rise. While the city's displaced usually try to go unnoticed, Seung-Kyu occupies the space with a quiet, penetrating authority, leaning against the cold stone as if it were a high-backed chair in a boardroom. Talia approaches him, leaning forward with a playful, self-assured smile, and offering a way out through a $1,000 contract to play the part of a silent, wealthy investor. However, the power dynamic shifts the moment he looks up. His gaze isn't desperate, it's observant, tracking her movements with a predatory stillness that makes her knowing smile feel suddenly fragile. When he accepts, it isn't with the gratitude of a poor man, but with the amused compliance of a king playing along with a commoner's game. This introduction cements the core tension. Talia believes she has bought a tool, but the reader understands she has just invited a master architect into her foundation. The city lights of Seoul blurred into streaks of amber and violet, a stark contrast to the heavy, oppressive humidity of the evening. Talia Brooks adjusted the lapel of her black leather jacket, the material cool and slick beneath her fingertips. She was a woman built on calculations, of risk, of ROI, of human nature. And right now, her calculations told her that the man sitting against the cold granite of the Hangguang building was the missing variable in her equation. He was a shadow in a hoodie, a dark smudge against the luxury storefront's pristine glass. Most people in his position slouched, trying to become invisible to the high-heeled pedestrians. But he sat with a terrifying, casual grace. He didn't look up as she approached. He didn't need to. He simply existed in the space, his stillness vibrating with a frequency that made the hair on Talia's arms stand up. "You look like a man who knows how to keep a secret," Talia said, her voice smooth, projecting a playful confidence she wasn't entirely sure she felt. She leaned forward, resting a hand on the building's ledge, allowing a knowing smile to curve her lips. "And I happen to be in the market for a very specific kind of silence." The man didn't move, but the atmosphere around him shifted. Slowly, he tilted his head back. From the depths of the dark fabric, a pair of intense, calculating eyes met hers. They weren't the eyes of a desperate man. They were the eyes of a wolf watching a bird fly too close to the ground. "A secret for a secret, Miss Brooks?" he rasped. His voice was a low vibration, like gravel over velvet. Talia's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She hadn't introduced herself. "You've done your homework. That saves us some time." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a slim, high-end tablet, flicking a digital contract onto the screen. $1,000. I'm 7 days. You play the role of a silent partner, an investor with old money and a short fuse for small talk. I provide the suits, the script, and the entry to the gala. You provide the presents. She expected a scramble for the money, or at least a flicker of greed. Instead, Han Seung-Kyu looked at the tablet as if it were a curious insect. He didn't reach for it. He stayed perfectly still, his gaze boring into her, dismantling the street-smart entrepreneur persona she wore like armor. $1,000 is a steep price for a mask, he said, his tone unreadable. What are you really buying, Talia? Protection or a distraction? Both, she countered, regaining her footing. She leaned closer, the scent of expensive perfume mixing with the metallic tang of the city rain. I'm buying a shield. The corporate vultures think I'm vulnerable because I'm alone. I need them to see a predator at my side so they stop looking at my software as prey. Seung-Kyu let out a short, dry chuckle that didn't reach his eyes. He stood up in one fluid, controlled motion, suddenly towering over her. The hoodie fell back slightly, revealing a jawline like carved obsidian. "The game has already started," he murmured, his voice dropping an octave. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from hers before he took the tablet. "But be careful. Sometimes when you hire a shadow to hide in, the shadow ends up hiding you. He signed with a swift, elegant stroke. The contract was sealed. Talia felt a surge of triumph, but the transition from the rain-slicked pavement to the sterile, overlit luxury of a Gangnam private atelier was a silent one. Talia sat on a velvet ottoman, her leather jacket draped over her knees, watching as a team of high-end tailors descended upon the man she had essentially bought for the week. She had expected to feel a sense of smug satisfaction, the kind one feels when polishing a rough stone. But as the grime of the city was stripped away, her confidence began to fray at the edges. The transformation wasn't a slow build, it was an unveiling. When the dark, weathered hoodie was finally discarded, it revealed a physique that made the lead tailor pause mid-measurement. Seung-Kyu didn't have the lean, pampered look of the trust fund heirs Talia usually dealt with. His shoulders were broad, his back mapped with the hard, functional muscle of someone intimately acquainted with violence. He stood perfectly still, when his eyes fixed on his own reflection with a detached, clinical intensity that made the tailors move with uncharacteristic, hushed reverence. "The charcoal wool silk blend, Miss Brooks?" the head stylist whispered, holding up a jacket that cost more than Talia's first car. Talia nodded, her throat suddenly dry. She watched through the mirror as they draped the fabric over him. The transformation was total. With his hair swept back and the obsidian jawline finally clean-shaven, the beggar vanished. In his place stood a man who didn't just look like a billionaire, he looked like the man who decided which billionaires were allowed to keep their fortunes. When the last adjustment was made, Seung-Kyu turned toward her. The charcoal suit clung to his frame with lethal precision, the dark tie knotted with a mathematical exactness. The transformation was more than aesthetic. It was an amplification of the terrifying grace she had sensed in the alley. The masculine authority he projected was absolute, a gravitational pull that seemed to warp the very air in the room. He walked toward her, his stride echoing with the heavy, deliberate pace of a man who had never been told, "No." Talia found herself standing up, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was used to being the most powerful presence in the room, the initiator, the strategist, but as he stopped inches away, she felt small, not weak, but eclipsed. "Does the mask fit your requirements, Talia?" he asked. The low rasp of his voice was now framed by the elegance of his appearance, making the sound even more dangerous. Talia forced herself to maintain eye contact, searching for a trace of the man from the sidewalk. It was gone. His eyes were cold, sharp, and deeply intelligent, dismantling her carefully curated composure. "You look different," she managed, her voice lacking its usual professional edge. Seung-Kyu reached out, his fingers grazing the sleeve of her leather jacket. The touch was light, but the heat of it felt like a brand. "I look like the man you hired," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second before returning to her eyes. "But remember what I told you. A shield only works if you stay behind it. If you try to lead me, you might find out that I don't follow." Talia swallowed hard, the triumph of her successful purchase replaced by a simmering nervous tension. She had set out to create a polished weapon to wield against her enemies. But as she looked at Han Seung-Kyu, she realized the weapon was already loaded, and she had no idea whose hand was on the trigger. She looked at him. She realized her project was already off script. The deal was struck, but for the first time in her life, Talia felt like the one being handled. The grand ballroom of the Ankara Plaza was a cathedral of glass and gold, designed to make the ambitious feel small and the established feel eternal. Talia stepped onto the marble floor, her heels clicking with a precision that masked the frantic thrum of her pulse. She looked the part, her curls styled into a sleek side part, her makeup polished, and her black leather jacket swapped for a gown that moved like liquid smoke. But the real weight on her arm was the man beside her. Seung-Kyu moved through the crowd with the heavy, effortless stride of an apex predator in a room full of peacocks. He didn't look at the opulence, he looked through it. The way he held himself, the broad line of his shoulders and the unreadable intensity of his gaze, drew eyes from every corner of the room. The whispers followed them like a wake. Stay close, Talia murmured, her smile fixed for the cameras. The vultures are already circling. Let them circle, Seung-Kyu replied, his voice a low, vibrating rasp that seemed to anchor her to the floor. They're looking for a weakness. Don't give them one. The first strike came from the left. Tafari, Talia's ex-partner and a man whose ego was as inflated as his venture capital, stepped into their path. He wore a grin that didn't reach his eyes and held a flute of champagne like a scepter. Talia, darling, Tafari drawled, his gaze raking over her before settling on Seung-Kyu with a look of practiced condescension. I see you finally realized that a boutique firm needs a bit of muscle to stay relevant. Is this the new head of security, or did you find him guarding a construction site? Talia felt the familiar heat of irritation rise in her chest, but before she could sharpen her tongue, the air beside her turned arctic. Seung-Kyu didn't speak. He didn't even shift his stance. He simply turned his head and looked at Tafari. It wasn't a look of anger. It was a look of profound, absolute recognition, the way a master looks at a flawed piece of work before discarding it. His eyes were cold, dark wells of ancient authority that seemed to strip Tafari of his tailored suit and his borrowed confidence. The silence that followed was deafening. Yet Tafari's grin faltered, then withered. He opened his mouth to deliver a cutting remark, but the words died in his throat. He took a half-step back, his hand trembling slightly, splashing champagne onto his sleeve. The masculine authority Seung-Kyu projected wasn't just a suit or a pose, it was a physical force that crushed the oxygen out of Tafari's personal space. I have a meeting with the board, Tafari stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. He didn't look at Talia again. He turned and retreated into the crowd, his gait uneven, leaving a vacuum of stunned silence behind him. Talia exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked up at Seung-Kyu, whose expression hadn't changed by a single degree. He looked as if he had just swatted a fly. You didn't say anything, she whispered, then her heart doing a strange, fluttering roll. Men like him don't listen to words, Seung-Kyu said, his gaze sweeping the room, causing a group of nearby investors to immediately avert their eyes. They only understand power, and right now, Talia, you have all of it. As they moved deeper into the den of vipers, Talia realized the game had changed. She had wanted a shield, but she was starting to fear that she had unleashed something the city wasn't prepared to handle. The adrenaline from the ballroom still hummed in Talia's veins as they stepped out into the humid Seoul night. The gala had been a victory, but the air between her and Seung-Kyu had grown thick with a new kind of tension, one that didn't feel like part of the script. As they waited for the valet, Talia caught a glimpse of movement in the reflection of a nearby storefront. A black sedan sat idling 50 yards away, its headlights extinguished. Two men stood near the corner, dressed in the kind of nondescript suits that were meant to blend in but only succeeded in screaming professional security. They weren't looking at her. Their eyes were fixed on the back of Seung-Kyu's head with a focused, deferential intensity that chilled her more than the night air. "We're being followed," Talia whispered, her hand tightening instinctively on Seung-Kyu's arm. She expected him to tense to look for an exit, or to show the flicker of fear a poor man should feel when targeted by the elite. Instead, Seung-Kyu didn't even turn around. He adjusted his cufflink, his expression as flat and calm as a frozen lake. "I know," he said, his voice dropping into that low, dangerous rasp. They've been there since we left the atelier." Talia's heart skipped. Tafari's people? Or the developers? Neither, Seung-Kyu replied. He finally looked at her, and for a second the mask of the hired date slipped. The intensity in his eyes wasn't just masculine authority, it was the cold, calculating weight of someone who managed entire systems of power. "They aren't here to hurt us, Talia. They're here to ensure no one else does." The valet pulled up in her sleek white coupe, but as Seung-Kyu opened the door for her, Talia hesitated. She looked at the men on the corner again. One of them touched an earpiece and gave a short, sharp nod. Not a threat, but a report. A salute. "Who are you?" she asked, the question barely a breath. The street-smart intuition she prized so much was screaming at her now. She had looked at him on that sidewalk and seen a tool she could use to build her own kingdom, but as the sedan began to pull out to follow them, she realized she had been standing in the middle of his kingdom all along. "I'm the man you hired for $1,000, he said, though the words felt like a hollow irony now. He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over her, blocking out the neon glare of the city. "But if I were you, I'd stop looking at the shadows behind us and start looking at the code you're so proud of. The wolves aren't just on the street, Talia. They're already inside your walls." He slid into the passenger seat with a fluid, silent grace that no beggar could ever possess. As Talia gripped the steering wheel, her hands were trembling. She had spent her life learning how to navigate the city's boardrooms and back alleys, convinced she was the smartest person in any room. But as she pulled into traffic, with the mysterious black sedan trailing them like a silent guardian, she realized she hadn't just hired a shield. She had invited the architect of the entire game into her car, and she was no longer sure who was driving. The office of Brooks Urban Development was a sanctuary of glass and brushed steel, but tonight, the atmosphere felt brittle. Talia sat behind her mahogany desk, her fingers flying across the keyboard as red alert boxes began to bloom across her monitors like digital blood. Someone was shredding her server architecture from the inside out, systematically deleting the zoning permits and architectural renders for the redevelopment contract. "They're bypassing the firewall," Talia whispered, her voice tight with a rare flick of panic. "It's a recursive wipe. If I don't stop this in 3 minutes, the firm is dead." Seung-Kyu, who had been standing by the floor-to-ceiling window watching the city lights, moved with a sudden, predatory intent. He didn't approach the desk to look at the screen. Instead, he pulled a sleek, encrypted satellite phone from the pocket of his charcoal trousers, the one Talia had seen earlier. "You have 2 minutes to find the source of the Viper protocol hitting the Brooks server," Seung-Kyu said into the phone. His voice wasn't the gravelly rasp of a beggar anymore. It was a cold, absolute command that expected nothing less than perfection. "Isolate the node and redirect the packet loss to the sender's primary offshore account. Do it now." Talia froze, her hands hovering over the keys. "Who are you talking to?" "Seung-Kyu, this is a private internal network. No one can—" "Refresh your screen, Talia," he interrupted, his gaze never leaving the skyline. She hit the key. The red warnings vanished. In their place, a stream of green data began to reconstruct her files at a speed that defied standard commercial bandwidth. But more than that, a new window popped up, a live feed of a server farm in Singapore, showing a frantic technician staring at a crashing terminal. "The sabotage didn't just stop," Talia murmured, her eyes wide as she traced the routing headers. You counter-hacked them. You used a Tier 1 backbone. Only the central bank or the architects group has that kind of reach." She looked up at him, the polished leather of her chair creaking in the silence. Seung-Kyu turned, the moonlight catching the sharp, obsidian line of his jaw. He looked entirely at home in her high-rise office, more so than she did. The illusion of her being the initiator was now a pile of dust at her feet. "A street dweller doesn't have a direct line to Singaporean data centers," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and a burgeoning, dangerous curiosity. "You didn't need my $1,000. You didn't even need the suit." Seung-Kyu walked toward her, stopping only when he was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his frame. He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of her chair, effectively pinning her with his shadow. "I needed to see who was brave enough to approach a monster in a hoodie," he whispered, his breath ghosting over her skin. "And I needed to see if you were worth the protection you were trying to buy." "And am I?" Talia asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You're more than worth it," he said, his eyes darkening with an unreadable intensity. "But the glass ceiling didn't just crack, Talia. It's gone, and now you're going to see what the city looks like when the lights are turned off." Talia realized then that the corporate sharks were the least of her worries. She had invited a god of the underground into her life, and there was no way to go back to the world she thought she knew. The rain began as a fine mist and quickly spiraled into a torrential downpour, turning the city into a blurred mosaic of neon and gray. Talia didn't drive toward her apartment. Instead, she pulled the car into a secluded overlook near the river, and the engine cutting out with a soft mechanical sigh. The rhythmic drumming of water against the panoramic glass roof was the only sound, creating a pressurized chamber of forced intimacy. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Not yet. Her gaze was fixed on the wipers as they struggled against the deluge. "The satellite phone," she started, her voice barely a whisper against the storm. "The way you move. The way that man in the ballroom looked at you like you were a god he hadn't made enough sacrifices to." She finally turned, her dark curls damp at the temples, her brown skin glowing in the intermittent flash of lightning. "The beggar I met didn't have a direct line to a Tier 1 server backbone. He didn't have a security detail that salutes when he passes." Seung-Kyu remained in the passenger seat, his stillness so absolute it was eerie. The charcoal suit jacket was unbuttoned, and for the first time, Talia noticed a faint, jagged scar peeking out from beneath his collar, a mark that didn't belong on a man who had spent his life on a sidewalk. "You're a brilliant woman, Talia," he said, the low rasp of his voice vibrating through the small space of the car. "But you're obsessed with the why. You think if you can categorize me, you can control me." "I can't control a man I don't know," she snapped, her self-assured facade finally cracking. She leaned across the center console, her leather jacket creaking. "I invited you into my life, my office, my company. I thought I was giving a man a chance, but I've just handed a predator the map to my entire world. Who are you? Are you the one they're looking for, or are you the one they're running from?" Seung-Kyu moved then, emotion so swift it made her breath hitch. He didn't pull away. He leaned in, closing the distance until their faces were inches apart. The scent of rain and expensive sandalwood filled her lungs. His intense dark eyes scanned her face, dismantling her defenses with a single penetrating look. "I am whatever you need me to be to survive this week," he murmured, his hand coming up to rest on the back of her head, his fingers threading through her curls with a possessive, terrifying tenderness. "But don't mistake my silence for a lack of identity. You wanted a lethal partner. You wanted a shield. Well, you have one. But shields don't just stop bullets, Talia. They hide what's standing behind them." The tension in the car reached a breaking point, a heavy electric heat that made the air feel thin. Whereas Talia felt the gravitational pull of his presence, the dangerous allure of a man who was clearly the architect of a world she didn't understand. She should have been afraid, should have opened the door and run into the rain, but her hand found the lapel of his suit instead. "I don't like being lied to," she breathed, her knowing smile replaced by something raw and desperate. "Then stop lying to yourself," he countered, his thumb grazing her lower lip. "You didn't pick me because I was poor. You picked me because you recognized the monster in me. Because it's the only thing that can match the one in you." Outside, the rain thundered on, but inside, the silence was absolute. The calm before a reveal that threatened to drown them both. The following evening, the city's upper atmosphere was a cathedral of glass and wind, and the rooftop of the Obsidian Heights Tower offered a panoramic view of a skyline Talia hoped to own, but the air felt thin and sharp. The gala was in full swing, yet the music from the floors below was a muffled heartbeat, ignored by the man who stood at the edge of the helipad. Julian Thorne, the predatory mogul who had spent years trying to swallow Talia's firm whole. Talia stood alone near the glass railing, her silk gown whipping around her legs like a warning flag. Seung-Kyu was nowhere to be seen, having disappeared into the crowd moments after they arrived. Thorne stepped out of the shadows, flanked by 4 men whose heavy coats did little to hide the tactical holsters at their ribs. "You're a persistent woman, Talia," Thorne said, his voice oily and devoid of warmth. "But this contract isn't for boutique dreamers. It's for the adults who built this city. I offered you a buyout. Now I'm offering you an exit." "Threats in a tuxedo, Julian?" Talia countered, though her hand drifted toward her clutch where her phone sat uselessly. "You're slipping. The board will never approve a contract signed in blood." "The board won't know," Thorne smiled, a cold, clinical expression. "You're going to have an unfortunate accident on a rain-slicked roof, and your investor friend? We've already taken care of the beggar." He nodded to his men. They stepped forward, the circle closing. Talia's back hit the cold glass. Just as the lead enforcer reached for her, a sound tore through the wind, a sharp electronic chirp followed by the sudden, synchronized vibration of every phone on the rooftop. "Stand down," a voice commanded. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, terrifyingly calm vibration that seemed to come from the sky itself. Seung-Kyu stepped out from behind a ventilation unit, but the man who emerged was gone. In his place was a figure of absolute, terrifying authority. He wasn't wearing the charcoal suit anymore. He was in a dark tactical overcoat, and in his hand was an obsidian-grade tablet that glowed with the schematics of the very building they stood upon. Behind him, a dozen shadows rose from the ledges, the professional security Talia had seen before, now armed and moving with the silent lethality of ghosts. "Who the hell are you?" Thorne hissed, his confidence evaporating as his own men froze, their ear-peers suddenly screaming with feedback. "You've spent 10 years trying to buy the city, Thorne," Seung-Kyu said, walking forward. The shadow architect persona wasn't just a title. It was a reality. With a flick of his finger on the tablet, the lights of the entire district below them blinked out, then surged back to life in a pattern that spelled out a single corporate sigil, the mark of the Han conglomerate. "I'm the man who designed the system you're trying to cheat." The enforcers dropped their weapons. They knew that silhouette. They knew the face of the man who controlled the city's digital and physical marrow. Seung-Kyu reached Talia, stepping between her and the predators. He didn't look back at her, but his presence was a fortress. "The beggar is dead, Julian, and if you ever look at her again, I will delete your existence from every ledger in this hemisphere." Thorne backed away, his face a mask of pure terror. Seung-Kyu finally turned to Talia. The coldness in his eyes softened just enough for her to see the man who had shared ramen with her in the rain. "I told you the wolves were inside the walls," he murmured. "I just didn't tell you I was the one who built the walls." The silence following the rooftop confrontation was heavier than the storm that had preceded it. Back within the reinforced walls of Talia's office, the city below looked like a sprawling circuit board, and for the first time, Talia understood that the man standing by her window owned every trace of current running through it. The charcoal suit was gone, replaced by the dark tactical gear that made him look like a ghost of the high-altitude winds. "You lied," Talia said, her voice echoing off the glass. She didn't move from her desk, her hands resting near the keyboard that had been her only weapon until tonight. "You sat on a sidewalk and watched me pity you. You let me believe I was the one with the upper hand." Seung-Kyu turned, the moonlight catching the sharp, unforgiving line of his profile. "I didn't lie about the shadows, Talia. I simply didn't tell you I was the one who cast them." He walked toward her, his boots silent on the polished floor. "You were looking for a tool. I was looking for a partner who didn't know how to flinch. If I had approached you from a boardroom, you would have seen a contract. From the street, I saw the truth of you." Talia felt the sting of his words, the realization that her street-smart intuition had been a curated test. She should have felt used, but as she looked at the data streams still pulsing on her monitors, and a different emotion took hold, a cold, predatory clarity. Thorne was still out there, hiding behind layers of offshore shells and corrupted permits, thinking he could survive the night. "Thorne thinks he's playing a game of real estate," Talia said, her knowing smile returning, though it was sharper now, edged with the same steel Seung-Kyu projected. "But he doesn't realize my urban data isn't just about zoning, it's about the flow of the city. I have the keys to his logistics, the timestamps of every bribe he's ever paid." Seung-Kyu leaned over her desk, his presence a gravitational pull she no longer fought. And I have the global reach to ensure those bribes are flagged by every major bank in the world before the sun rises. I can freeze his assets. But I need your local architecture to trap him in the cage. The alliance was forged in the friction between her local brilliance and his absolute authority. For the next 3 hours, the office became a war room. Talia's fingers flew, weaving her urban analytics into his Tier 1 network. They moved with a synchronized rhythm, a blend of her digital hustle and his global strike. It was a merger of two empires, one built from the grid of the streets, the other from the heights of the skyline. As the final command was sent, a series of red nodes on the map turned black. Julian Thorne's empire was being systematically erased, his wealth liquidated into the very social housing projects he had tried to demolish. "It's done," Talia whispered, leaning back. She looked up at Seung-Kyu, seeing not a beggar or a billionaire, but the only person who truly understood the price of power. "No," Seung-Kyu murmured, his hand resting on the back of her chair, his gaze dark and possessive. "It's just the beginning. We've cleared the field. Now we build the throne." Talia reached out, her fingers brushing the tactical fabric of his sleeve. The deception was over, but the dangerous, intimate tension was only just beginning to settle into something permanent. The transition from the digital battlefield to the seat of power was seamless, marked not by a celebration, but by a chillingly quiet efficiency. The boardroom of the city's redevelopment council was a cavern of polished ebony and silver, its air heavy with the scent of old money and new fear. At the head of the table sat the high-status investors who had once viewed Talia as a temporary nuisance, a boutique dreamer to be tolerated until a larger predator consumed her. Talia walked into the room first. She wore her signature black leather jacket over a structural silk dress, her curls perfectly set, her knowing smile now anchored by the weight of absolute leverage. Behind her, the heavy double doors clicked shut as Seung-Kyu entered. He no longer needed the tactical gear or the charcoal suit to command the room. He wore a simple, dark turtleneck and trousers, yet the investors recoiled as if a ghost had stepped into the light. The shadow architect didn't sit. He stood behind Talia, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of public alignment that caused several pens to drop onto the table. "The terms have changed," Talia said, her voice a steady melodic force that filled the silence. She slid a single, reinforced tablet into the center of the table. "Julian Thorne has liquidated his interests. Brooks Urban Development is now the primary stakeholder in the district's future. We aren't here to ask for your approval. We're here to present the new order." One of the senior board members, a man who had spent decades sneering at independent startups, looked from Talia to the man standing like a monolith behind her. "And who exactly is this we?" he stammered, his eyes darting to Seung-Kyu. "The man from the street?" Seung-Kyu leaned forward, the moonlight-sharp line of his jaw catching the dim light. He didn't raise his voice, but the low rasp of it made the boardroom feel like a trap. "The man from the street built the grid you're sitting on," he murmured. "The woman beside me holds the keys to its pulse. You can sign the partnership, or you can watch your dividends vanish into the same shadows that swallowed Thorne." There was no further debate. The scratching of expensive fountain pens was the only sound in the room as the contracts were finalized. For the first time, Talia felt the true shift in the gravitational pull of her life. She was no longer the desperate initiator trying to hustle for a seat at the table. She had built the table, and she had done it by recognizing the king hiding in the pauper's shroud. When the room cleared, leaving only the two of them in the amber glow of the city's twilight, Seung-Kyu finally took the seat beside her. He took her hand, his fingers tracing the edge of her leather sleeve. "You got what you wanted, Talia," he said, his gaze dark and unreadable. "The contract, the city, the power." Talia leaned back, looking out at the skyline that now belonged to them both. "I got more than that," she said, her smile turning soft, almost real. "I found the only person in this city who doesn't need a mask." The poor man was gone, and the reclusive heir had returned to his throne, but as they stood together overlooking their unified empire, the world finally understood the truth. They weren't just partners in a contract, they were the new architects of the city, ruling from the boardrooms to the back alleys, where no one would ever question the power of the woman who dared to look into the shadows.